In this lockdown, I find myself being drawn again to Psalm 84. And it's a psalm that speaks so powerfully of the blessings that can come through putting our faith in God. And so in verse 5, the psalmist says, "Blessed are those whose strength lies in you, in God." Now, whilst we're stuck at home and unable to go out or go to church, we may find ourselves feeling utterly powerless. And after all, we're in a situation that's totally beyond our control. So does our faith make a difference in this situation? Do we discover that our helplessness really is in God, in Him? Well, I guess one of the problems we all face is our tendency to think that because we feel powerless, because we feel helpless, that our prayers will be powerless too. Indeed, I've heard people speaking about the power of prayer, as though it's the prayers themselves that can change the situation. And the implication is really that it's the conviction of the person praying, or the fervour with which they pray, that is going to make a difference. But in reality, there's not a scrap of power in prayer. The power lies in the God behind the prayer, the God who answers our prayers. Charles Spurgeon used to speak about those who believed that the power of preaching lay in the lungs of the preacher. Of course it doesn't. Power lies in the God behind our prayers and indeed behind our preaching. Blessed then are the men and women whose strength is in God. And the psalmist gives us a clue as to how this is. He said those who've set their hearts on pilgrimage. And actually in our Pew Bibles, those words are translated like this: in whose heart are highways to Zion. What on earth does that mean? What's he talking about? How can we have highways in our hearts? Well, of course, there's a lot of references to highways in the scriptures. And often they refer to what needs to be done to prepare the way for the coming of the Lord, the Messiah, the promised one, the Christ. Remember how John the Baptist came to prepare the way for Jesus. In the words of Isaiah, he came to make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. And Isaiah, 700 years before, foretold how that would be. Every valley, he said, shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, and the rugged places a plain. And that's really this process of which the psalmist is referring to. That's what he has in mind when he speaks about making straight in our hearts a highway for our God. You see, it's all a question of focus. If we focus on God and his presence, the valley will become a plain. If we focus on our troubles, and of course the one that's the forefront of our minds at the moment is this pandemic, COVID-19, then it'll become a pit. And the same is true, of course, if we use the analogy of a mountain. If we turn our focus on God, then the mountains of difficulty, the insurmountable hills that we face, will be brought down. Every mountain will be made low. So focusing on God and his strength is the way we begin to make highways into our hearts for his Spirit to come. And the psalmist goes on to describe what happens when the Spirit comes. As they pass through the valley of Baca, he says, they make it into a place of springs. The autumn rains also cover it with pools. The Valley of Baca actually probably didn't exist in a physical sense, although the Muslims claim that that's where the first mosque was built, in other words, Mecca. But my belief is that this valley is a picture of the darkest times in our lives, the place of tears and mourning and weeping. You see, Baca means just that, weeping. And I'm sure it describes how many people are feeling at the moment. But, there's a lovely promise in another psalm, Psalm 125. It says, they who sow in tears shall reap in joy. And the truth is, when we bring our tears to God, he can turn our negative experiences into blessings. They become wells of grace, wells of living water. Indeed, both the springs and the rain to which the psalmist refers are pictures of the activity of God's Spirit. He recognizes that the way out of the desert, out of that valley, is to focus on God, to build in our hearts a highway for his Spirit to come. And that involves turning away from relying on ourselves and our circumstances and admitting our need for him. In that way, he can actually help us pass through the valley of weeping and make it a place of springs. And note the psalmist doesn't speak about living in the valley of Baca. He talks about passing through it. It's a momentary experience. Even if it seems to go on for a long time, it will eventually come to an end. It will give way to joy. So what counts during this time of lockdown, of confinement, is where our focus is. Focus on the problems and they'll overcome us. Focus on God and he will lift us out of those dark times and bring us to a place of joy.